This is an oral history with Joe Legare, and he works for the Department of Energy and is involved in the Rocky Flats cleanup and closure. And this is Dorothy Charlo doing the oral history, and I am with the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum and also the Carnegie Library. And we're doing this oral history on May 24th, 2005. And we're doing it in Joe's office with the Department of Energy in Broomfield. Okay. One thing I didn't mention to you, we always like to start with a question, when and where were you born? So if you don't object to that.
Not at all. I was born in Fort Meade, Maryland in 1963 in an Army hospital, Kimbrough Army Hospital.
And does that mean that your parents were in the service?
My father was in the service. He was in the Air Force for 8 years. We moved around quite a bit while he was in the Air Force. And then I followed in his footsteps, being in the Navy for 8 years.
I see. And just to go back a little bit, did you move around a lot as in your childhood?
We did. He had a lot of opportunities overseas. So I was, I believe, 2 years old when we moved to Turkey, and we lived in Ankara for 2.5 years. And then at the age of 7, I moved to Japan with my family. We lived there for 3 years. And then as a teenager, I lived in Australia, right in the center, just about on the Tropic of Capricorn in Alice Springs, Australia, for a couple of years. So that was a great opportunity growing up to see those different cultures.
Yeah. And then did you come back here for college, or what
I did. I moved around there a bit as well. When I returned to the United States from Australia, I decided to start college in lieu of my senior year of high school. So I started at a community college in Maryland, and then I went to the University of Maryland, and then transferred my junior year to the University of Florida. They had a very good chemistry program. I was a chemistry major, and I stayed there for 2 years and graduated with my bachelor's. Later, when I had moved back up to Maryland, Virginia area, I went to American Catholic University and to Virginia Tech, did graduate studies, and then ultimately got a master's degree out here at Colorado School of Mines in environmental science and engineering.
I see. And you said that you were in the Navy somewhere in...
I was right out of college. I was recruited by the Silent Service. They do their campus recruiting trips and took me to a submarine in Charleston, South Carolina, and to another one in Kings Bay, Georgia. And that sounded very exciting. And so I actually joined just prior to leaving college, and then got my degree and went through all of my training to be a submarine officer. So I spent 8 years in the submarine service, the last 3 of which I was at the Pentagon doing submarine-related work there. And that was where I got my start. Moving just across the Potomac River to the Department of Energy was a very smooth transition. I had a line on an interview, and I was successful with that. And so it was very seamless. One day I took a right to the Pentagon. The next day I took a left to the Department of Energy. So it was a very seamless transition getting out of the military and into a different line of work.
And what was your, that was your desire?
Very much so, very much so.
Why was that?
I had enjoyed my time in the Navy immensely. Very positive experience. My grandfather was a submariner in World War II. I have an uncle that was a submariner, and so it was very nice to be able to carry on that tradition. But I had other interests as well, and for the next 12 years in submarines, I would have predominantly been at sea. And so very central and singular in focus. I liked the Department of Energy environmental mission. It was right about that time that the department, this was 1992, where we were starting to get our sea legs, so to speak, on the environmental mission. It had previously been a production mission, and to a limited extent still is, but it was when we first started to reconcile the legacy of the Cold War, having won that and seeing some of that very visibly in 1989 in Germany and in the Baltic states and in Poland. And now for us, the Department of Energy, looking at our legacy, which was both positive but also had a negative aspect related to the environmental liability. And so I was starting to become aware of those things. I'd always had an interest in an environmental career, and it was just an excellent opportunity to get in on the ground floor, really, within the first year or two of the mission really being realized within the Department of Energy. So it was a very interesting time for the department, defining their mission, prioritizing the risk reduction activities and which things we should do first, characterizing, understanding the nature of the problems. And so I started there at headquarters in Washington.
Now, at that time, was that when Admiral Watkins was still there?
Yes, for a brief period while I was at Forrestal Building in Washington, Admiral Watkins was running the department, followed by Secretary O'Leary. And so I saw actually quite a few changes in my brief tenure in the Department of Energy. But Admiral Watkins was there and I think focused on discipline of operations and procedures, and not unlike the Navy. And then followed by Secretary O'Leary, who I think was our first secretary that started with outreach and openness and declassifying documents that no longer needed to be classified. And so quite a contrast in styles, but I think with each secretary, as with each manager out here at Rocky Flats, we had the right person for the job at the right time. And it's I think partly been fortuitous that that has happened, and we've had just the right personality and the right interests for the mission of the department, and as it flows down to what it means locally here at Rocky Flats, we've been very fortunate.
Yeah. Now, how did you get from there in '92 to here, Rocky Flats, in '96? What?
My job at headquarters was to implement a program in the field offices that had to do with discipline of operations. And by discipline, I'm referring to following procedures, to being sure that a system is engineered properly, those types of things, so that we are a professional organization, and that the tasks that we perform in our field offices are governed by procedures and by safe operating envelopes, we call them. So it was an excellent job to start with in the Department of Energy, because I visited virtually every site, including Richland and the Oak Ridge office in Tennessee, Savannah River in South Carolina, the Idaho office up in West Milton, New York, and indeed Rocky Flats. And so I had a very good overview of the different missions that, recall, back as recently as the 80s and certainly the 60s and 70s, were very separate from one another in terms of knowledge and information about what was going on at the other sites by design. It was need to know. It was separating different aspects of the nuclear production mission for security purposes. And so it was rather unique, and I think in the big scheme of things, rather recent phenomenon, that I could go to all of these different sites, as others did, and learn the historical mission there, and then also gain some context of the cleanup. And so it was at the end of my time at headquarters that when I started looking at the field offices, and in particular Rocky Flats. I was also interested in Richland. They both had unique and special missions. And so came out here in mid-1996 to look at the other end of the assignment. At headquarters, more policy, budget, broad-based initiatives. Out in the field, pick up a shovel. You know, not literally, maybe figuratively for me, but certainly on the contractor side, literally. And learning what it means tactically versus strategically to effect a cleanup. To understand that it's more complicated than writing down what you intend to do and executing it. There are community interests community interests. There are regulators and requirements. There are congressional interests, as well as the workforce that has a labor union or unions. And so it was quite an eye-opening experience and quite a learning experience to see that it is much more complex and involved when you're here in the field in implementing what seemingly may seem less complicated from Washington when I was there, of moving a drum or digging up a ditch of contaminated soil or tearing down a building. And there are a lot of folks that are very interested in what is going on here, be it the community members that we sometimes call stakeholders or the regulators. Is our air going to be protected? Is our water going to be protected? I want to report on your progress. And so all of these things were new to me, and it was really an excellent opportunity with the diversity of operations here and the diversity of citizenry, be it from Boulder or Jefferson County or from any of the cities. We have stakeholders that come up from Denver to our meetings, and they don't all have the same opinion about what we've done or what we're doing. And so it was quite a challenge, quite an interesting challenge.
Now, what is your particular role in the cleanup and in relating to the regulators and the stakeholders?
Well, fundamentally, being with the Department of Energy, and then more specifically with myself, with the Department of Energy, we really have three roles. We define the scope of work that needs to be done. And for us, it was to clean up this site by 2006. Secondarily, we oversee the work that's being done to make sure that taxpayers' dollars are being spent effectively and to ensure that the work is done safely. Absolutely, it's a federal function, inherently federal. And then third is to provide feedback to that process, to ensure that we learn lessons from our mistakes and learn from our successes back into the work planning and work execution. My role within that federal role, while it's changed a little bit over the years, for the past 9 years, has essentially been first providing that oversight of the scope and implementation and feedback on the environmental restoration activities, and that's fairly broad in scope, but it primarily would refer to digging up dirt, removing pipes, removing tanks that have been contaminated, those types of things. Second, beyond the environmental restoration is waste management. I worked the project when we shipped our first load of transuranic waste down to New Mexico.
This was to WIP, right?
To the WIP facility in New Mexico. And then third, interfacing with the regulators. The cleanup agreement was signed just before I arrived.
I was going to ask you that. That was the
Rocky Flats cleanup agreement. Yes.
And that was in 96. Then.
That was in the summer of 1996. Maybe it was late spring. Mm-hmm. And
so you weren't a part of doing that?
I did not negotiate that agreement. Mm-hmm. I implemented the agreement. Mm-hmm. And but there were folks here that were involved in the negotiation that were very helpful in terms of helping me to understand the context under which the agreement was negotiated. And that was, in fact, the advice that I received when I arrived here from my predecessor, Jessie Roberson, who became the manager here, and she'd had a job not unlike the one that I have now, not exactly, but very close. And the advice that she had given me as I was starting out was to work well with the regulators. Mm-hmm. That was it. She said that is so important to the success of our cleanup that you need to commit yourself to working with the regulators.
And by the regulators, that would be Environmental Protection Agency, Colorado Department of Health?
Yes,
those two
that would be primarily the State Health Department and the EPA, the local region, which is Region 8. And then, to a certain extent as well, and more recently, the Fish and Wildlife Service, as we've had some threatened and endangered species issues at the site, and so they're a regulator in that capacity. And to a lesser extent, the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board, not officially a regulator, but chartered by Congress and had oversight of our nuclear facility operations from the aspect of safety. And so her advice was work well with the regulators, and that's been a big part of my job here over the past 9 years, is to implement the cleanup agreement with the state and the EPA, and to ensure that their interests and our interests are aligned such that there is not a discernible difference between implementing our contract with Kaiser-Hill to clean up the site and meeting the regulators' expectations as defined by the cleanup agreement. And by and large, that's worked very well, and that's been true in terms of the alignment. There are small areas where the alignment is not complete, and those are issues that we have an ongoing negotiation with the regulators and primarily relate to post-closure. When Kaiser-Hill is done, what's our ongoing relationship with the state and EPA? Mm-hmm. And so environmental restoration, waste management, working with the regulators, and a role that grew for me that I did not realize was one of my roles coming out here was working with the community. Mm-hmm. And particularly as other people departed or rotated, and as you know, nature abhors a vacuum. I became more integrated with that and ended up doing more briefings until more recently had more of a prominent role working at Citizens Advisory Board and government council meetings to inform them about the cleanup and to receive information on our plans.
Uh-huh. So you haven't actually been involved in the negotiating of any of the particular agreements. You're more ensuring that...
Well, that's an interesting question, because on the face of it, the cleanup agreement was negotiated back in 1996, nearly 10 years ago. But in fact...
It has been changed, hasn't it?
Well, it's been modified, but even more to the point, the day-to-day implementation of the cleanup agreement is an ongoing negotiation. The folks that wrote, drafted, negotiated the cleanup agreement in 1995, 1994 could not possibly have foreseen all of the details and complexities of this cleanup. And therefore, in many cases, the language was broad in terms of protection of water quality, in terms of tearing down buildings or digging up contaminated soil. There were always tactical considerations that needed to be negotiated, and in some cases policy issues would rise that weren't foreseen back in the 90s that would require negotiation. So I think I've viewed the implementation of the cleanup agreement as almost a nonstop negotiation. And part of that is maintaining the relationship. And we can only work so closely together for so long if we can maintain the mutual trust and respect, even though there was plenty of opportunity for disagreement and moving forward with that disagreement. You had to, or I had to, on a daily basis, be cognizant of the relationship and where we are with that. Am I meeting the commitments that I said that I would keep? Are the regulators or is Kaiser-Hill meeting the commitments that they have made? Is there an issue that needs to be addressed? It's been out there and we've kind of been looking away a little bit, and now we say, we need to take that on because it's starting to hurt us and it's a hard issue. And so really the negotiation has been almost on a daily basis to ensure that we've moved this cleanup forward on a daily basis. We have never, in this area or any other area, and we could talk extensively about the union relationship and the workforce, never been able to rest on our laurels. It has been a daily exercise and commitment to implement this cleanup. This was not a matter of writing a cleanup contract with Kaiser-Hill and signing a cleanup agreement with the state and EPA and getting the appropriation from Congress and then sitting in autopilot. Every day there was a technical, political, budgetary, regulatory, stakeholder challenge, and there is even today and will be until we get to the final record of decision.
Now, somewhere along in here, the decision was made to speed things up. At least, from an outsider's perspective, it sounds like the original target was 2010, and then it got to be 2006. Can you talk a little bit about that, how that came about? I'm not sure
Yes.
the public really understands how
And
things can happen faster. Usually it's the other way around.
Part of the challenge for environmental management, as I talked about in the early 90s, where we realized we had a new mission to clean up these sites, was the entire Department of Energy is configured for production. And the production mission, and this is good news, you don't want the infrastructure around production to be too flexible and nimble. You want an infrastructure that ensures we're going to have criticality safety, I mean nuclear criticality safety, nuclear safety, radiological protection of the workforce. You don't want those systems to be too nimble when you're talking about an ongoing production mission. And so the challenge was now to come back and to address these risks and clean up these sites, creating an environment that changes every day as you tear down a building or take out a system, and relearning the administrative safety infrastructure and adapting that to this changing environment. When the initial analyses were done back in the mid-90s, when Tom Grumbly was Assistant Secretary for Environmental Management, and just prior to his tenure, we were looking at decades and billions of dollars. And part of that, I believe, was based on the old infrastructure, the infrastructure designed for the production mission. It was not nimble. It costs money, a lot of money, to stay safe, to protect the worker, to protect the communities. And then subsequently, the Assistant Secretary commissioned a second review, and those numbers came way down, the years and the dollars, and we were a little more critical in our thinking about how we could do things differently, as opposed to baselining this project the way we do things today. Then, and then under Tom Grumbly, he came up with the 10-year plan and said, you know, we're going to find a major site, it turned out to be Rocky Flats, that can close realistically in the next 10 years. And we can do this. We need to demonstrate this because the financial liability, and at some sites, the environmental liability and human health risk of sitting here does not stay the same. It gets worse every year. And that those risks need to be eliminated and those liabilities need to be reduced. And so he said, we're going to find that site and we're going to challenge them to close in 10 years. And that was Rocky Flats. Then Al Alm came along, the next Assistant Secretary, Al Alm, A-L-M. Okay. And Al Alm said, you know, I'm not going to have a new 10-year plan every year and have it still be 10 years. Mm-hmm. And so at the time it was 1996, and he said Rocky Flats is going to close in 2006. And so it was 10 years, but in 1997 it was going to be 2006, not 2007. And so that loosely is the pedigree of how we got to a 2006 closure.
Did changing technology in terms of handling waste and cleanup, was that a factor also?
The contractor, Kaiser-Hill, took on a lot of uncertainty in 1995 when they came to this site. And then even to a greater extent when we renewed their contract in 2000. And the reason they took on uncertainty and risk was our new contract was for completion, not for so many years. It's come here and work for 6 years, and if it's 2006 you're done. It was come here, apply your resources, and when you're finished, when the cleanup is finished, you're done under this contract. Very different than any other contract in environmental management ever.
So there was really an incentive.
They were incentivized, very much so, to find ways to do things more efficiently, to remain safe, because not only is it a moral and ethical responsibility for the safety of the workers, we found it's also good business practice. You can't do work if you're unsafe, if your buildings are shut down, if people are getting injured. And so they learned how to improve the safety record at Rocky Flats. we had some innovations with how we cleaned out what are called glove boxes, and just by its name you can imagine what it looks like, and everyone has seen them, whether it's in movies or perhaps at Rocky Flats, where you stick your hands through the gloves and that's where you do the work. And the plutonium is in this box, and that's how we stay safe. Cleaning out the glove boxes turned out to be quite a challenge. We came up with a chemical treatment that saved a great deal of time and money so that we could reduce the contamination levels in these boxes so that they didn't have to be cut up to go to a different facility. So that was a tremendous innovation. For large objects that we were shipping, I mean very large, bigger than my office, we came up with an innovation that is like a truck bed liner. And you've seen that, a truck bed liner, the spray-in liner, and we were spraying this contaminated equipment that might have been irregularly shaped or very large, and it served as the Department of Transportation compliant container. Again, saved a great deal of money and worker exposure by not having to go in and either decontaminate or chop up and put into smaller boxes and drums these large pieces of equipment. So those types of innovations, in addition to others, really helped to gain efficiencies and to move up the schedule, recognizing that this was a very expensive facility to keep open. Comparable to other DOE facilities, we were spending several $100 million a year just to keep the facility open and safe. That was without picking up a shovel or cutting a pipe up or shipping a drum. It was a couple $100 million a year to maintain our nuclear safety licenses and to ensure that we did not have nuclear criticalities and to ensure the workers were protected and the community was protected.
Why was that in contrast to others? Was it the production of the nuclear pits that made that difference, or what were there other factors?
Well, actually, it's not unlike other DOE facilities that have the type of material that we have, the plutonium, the uranium, the liquids with those same components in them. It's paying for a guard force. It is a nuclear license has many specific things that need to be done, such as workers going around and observing temperatures and pressures and lineups of piping systems and so forth. All of those things are expensive, and so there's a workforce, significant workforce, required just in the baseline condition, just to keep things safe, to keep ventilation running, to keep the special nuclear material secure from terrorists or anyone else that might be interested in looking into that. And so part of the challenge early on in the cleanup was to take that mortgage, we called it. You had to pay it every month. Whatever else you were doing on site, it was an expensive mortgage, couple $100 million a year, and figure out how to do mortgage reduction. Because the less you're paying on the mortgage, the more you have to spend on the cleanup. And so mortgage reduction after risk reduction was an essential strategy to being successful. If we continued to do business the old way, with the full suite of directives, with the inflexibilities of those directives, how they were applied to the production mission, we would not have achieved this cleanup by 2005, 2006 timeframe.
I gather that there's, and you alluded to it before, that there's been lots and lots of little crises along the way, and I would imagine that some of these, the things that got a lot of community attention, the trenches, the mound, the 903 pad, those all presented special problems?
That's a good question, and because the cleanup...
Or is that maybe not the case?
Well, the cleanup is not one flavor. That's right. It's many small cleanups, and the nature is different, whether it's water, soil, a tank, or inside a building. There was also not complete alignment between the hazard of a given aspect of the cleanup and community interest. In some cases, they were very well aligned, and such there was a great deal of interest about getting the special nuclear material off-site, and appropriately so. And in other cases, specific municipalities had specific interests. And it may or may not have been related to the risk, but may have been related to a perception or a historical aspect. For example, water quality, which has been very good for a long time, as long as I've been here, so over 10 years, also has a history. We found contaminated sediments in Stanley Lake, for example, related to the production era. And so that carries with it a certain suspicion and circumspection as we sample and report on water. So as an example of where the history has brought forward some feelings and some questioning attitudes, which is healthy. But in fact, overall our water quality is excellent, as an example. But what that, and I can come back to that question, but what you just raised for me was, it occurred to me a very important aspect of this cleanup that we haven't touched on yet. And it's trust. By design, almost, there was very low trust out here after the production mission was over, the FBI raid, the grand jury process, all prior to the cleanup mission. So then we come out, the environmentalists, to clean up this site, and we are met with distrust, and frankly, appropriately so. It's hard to argue with that, with the unkept promises, with the fire in '57 and the fire in 1969, with the contaminated sediments in Stanley Lake. While they didn't pose a human health risk, you don't want them there. And so there was certainly a series of things over the years, despite having a great deal of our workforce living in Arvada, in Broomfield and Westminster, for example, in Jefferson and Boulder County. There was still a larger citizenry that had that distrust. They didn't know much about Rocky Flats, but what they knew they didn't like. And so that became increasingly, for me and for others, the mission within the mission, which was to create community confidence and trust in what we were doing here. Because we all believe, in the spirit of public service, that we are doing everything we can to have a robust, compliant, conservative cleanup that will be safe for all uses when we're done here. And the challenge was, frankly, convincing people of that. Part of what we implemented nearly 10 years ago was a new way of doing business. The old way of doing business, shorthand, was announce and defend. And we've probably heard that in other contexts within the government, not just within federal government, but here's our plan, we're going to implement this now. What we went to, which was much more time-consuming, but I believe paid huge dividends, was here's an outline of what we're intending to do to Golden or Arvada or Westminster or the regulators. What do you think about that? And we'd get input. And sometimes we'd agree, sometimes we wouldn't agree, but the process was very important. And always, I believe, we made better decisions, or we had more confidence in the decision we were going to make, either way. And so we'd started very early on. The regulations stipulate very specific comment periods and formalities of formal comments. We preceded that by months, and in some cases years. Here's what we're planning to do. It looks like this. What do you think? What are your interests? And I believe that meant a lot to a lot of the folks that participated routinely in Rocky Flats issues, to say these folks really are trying to open the gates, if you will, to lift the shroud of secrecy. And to this day, that's how we do business. It's exhausting, and but it's worth it. And I think that's the only way you can, because if we were to arrive at the same place with the same decisions and the same cleanup, and let's just say we were able to achieve it in the same time period, but we did it the old-fashioned way. First, there's no way we could have achieved it. I'm convinced we'd still be on the 2035 path or longer, decades longer. We wouldn't have had that confidence in the cleanup. We wouldn't have had that trust. Rocky Flats would be stigmatized forevermore because while we would know that we had done a good job, no one else would know. And frankly, they wouldn't have had their fingerprints on it either. They wouldn't have been able to participate and to advise on what they knew. Some of the folks are very technical from the community that participate. Some are not, but they all have valuable opinions, and we receive those recommendations formally and informally. And that has, creating that trust with the community has just been essential to our success.
Are there particular ways that you can think of or that you've been involved with in where community input or specific person's input has changed the way things, the outcome?
I can even, I can cite a fundamental issue for which broad-based effect on this cleanup, for which the community had enormous effect based on their input, and that is our cleanup levels. Nothing more fundamental than the amount of dirt you're going to dig up to reach a certain level of contamination, if you will, to reduce it to that level or below. And we engaged in a approximately 18-month process with the community, and prior to that funded them to do their own studies on what the appropriate cleanup levels should be. They hired their own contractor. We gave them the money to do that so that they'd have that independence.
This was the soil...
The soil action levels, they were called. I simplify it, just cleanup levels, but the soil action levels. Mm-hmm. And so the community, we had a number. It was in the 600s that I could show you. Mm-hmm. Doing calculations is a regulatorily compliant number. The community was not very happy with that number at all. And so we continued to work with them for several years. They hired their own contractor to do a soil action level review. We got their numbers of what they thought the cleanup should be, and then B2. And then we engaged with them weekly for anywhere between 3 and 6 hours a week. And sometimes we'd miss a week, but over an 18-month period. And we went through modeling. We went through the body of science, just in the public domain, nationally and internationally. We took their input on the scenarios that we should be analyzing. They said, we don't want you to just analyze your scenarios. We want you to analyze a small farmer, a ranchette scenario, open space scenario, and so on. So we added their scenarios to our models to say, okay, let's look at that and let's just see what it means either way. And ultimately, at the end of that process, working with the regulators to make the decision, we arrived at a number that was right in the middle of the range that they had hired an independent contractor to produce some years before that process. And so at the very fundamental level, cleanup levels, the public and the local governments immeasurably influenced that process. And I believe we were satisfied as well. Part of, so you say, well, what was in it for you? Well, first was that process and getting to a number that everyone was comfortable with. But what we had asked our community to do as part of that process was to accept the same constraints that we had. And that was very interesting, and they were willing to do that by and large, and that included regulation, budget, other constraints that we would have just as a government entity. We said, you know, it's not realistic if we get recommendations that are pie in the sky. They have to have some foundation, and if you can show us the pedigree of a recommendation that is compliant and doesn't bust the bank and so on, then that is an easier recommendation to work with. And they responded to that. And so when we arrived at our number, and we had been through a process with them of making choices, surface versus subsurface, for example, we ended up in a place where most people and the agencies were very satisfied with the process and with the results. And it was worth the 2 to 3 year investment, I'd say it was.
Mm-hmm. Now that would be your role with DOE as opposed to Kaiser-Hill. Kaiser-Hill would never have made these decisions, is that right?
That's right, because the cleanup levels that we reset, we had established in '96 and then reset here just a couple of years ago, are a part of our cleanup agreement with the state and EPA. Kaiser-Hill is not a party to that agreement. It was Department of Energy, EPA, and State Health Department, or actually State of Colorado. And so those numbers were independent of our contract with Kaiser-Hill. Our contract with Kaiser-Hill defined a scope of work that they needed to implement separate from anything we've agreed to with the state and EPA. Mm-hmm. And so you could project that out a little bit, extrapolating, say, well, what if when Kaiser-Hill is finished, you haven't met all of your commitments in the cleanup agreement? Well, the answer is we still have those commitments and we would need to meet those. That will not be the case. In terms of the physical completion, we are working with our regulators and with Kaiser-Hill to ensure that when the cleanup contractor is done, the physical work is done. And part of what we talked about earlier about this ongoing negotiation and cajoling and integrating all of the interests. The regulators have interests, Kaiser-Hill has interests, the Department of Energy has interests, and that was part of it, is achieving that alignment between the cleanup agreement and the closure contract.
What for you personally have been maybe one or two of the most surprising discoveries in terms of what you've dealt with here?
We had a room in one of our buildings called an infinity room. And it was called infinity room because it pegged the meters. And so as far as we were concerned, the radiation levels were at infinity, or greater than we could measure. And the room had been sealed for quite some time, decades. And when we finally went in to clean out that room, we were expecting quite an environmental impact beneath the room, that acids may have eaten through the concrete or weaved their way through the concrete and into the soil. And it was one of several examples of where we had conservatively reported, even decades ago, the potential risk, and were pleasantly surprised that, in fact, the risk and the contamination was not there, or was not as bad as we had anticipated and planned for. There were several other examples of that nature where, particularly under the buildings, we were anticipating very hot soils from leaky pipes, and they didn't materialize. Part of it, I mean, that's good news, and part of it is also, we tend to discredit the folks that operated the plant back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s as not being environmentalists. And certainly when some of the principal environmental laws came into being late 70s, early 80s, it would be easy to jump on that bandwagon. But our experience has been, very surprisingly so, I must admit, that they've kept very good records, the plant operators, over the years, and that in general, they implemented conservative reporting. If they were pumping from tank A in one building to tank B in another building, and the mass balance didn't work out, they very conservatively reported that they had lost to a leaky pipe somewhere some liquids. And we would go sample and analyze and find that location, and typically find some contamination, but not to the extent that it could have been, and in some cases not at all. And so the workers, while they were here on that nuclear production mission, they had an environmental conscience, and they kept good records, and they were very concerned and conscientious about what was happening to the environment. Now the rules were different, and for example, we had talked earlier about trenches and what we were doing to pull those drums up, and that was standard practice, not just in the Department of Energy or the Atomic Energy Agency, but even in the private sector. And so that was part of our legacy, and part of what we needed to go back and remediate.
Mm-hmm. I remember when I was interviewing Jim Kelly, the labor president,
yes,
from a long time ago, he mentioned that he had been asked to come back with a group of workers, and I think this was at a particular point in the cleanup, maybe 94, 95, perhaps before
mm-hmm.
you were here, when they were discovering, unpleasant surprises. And he himself talked about being unpleasantly surprised at what, some of the workers confessed to, that he himself did not know it. Now, I know he was very worried that, things might have been much sloppier and things might have happened. Kind of what you're saying isn't completely consistent with that.
Well, it may be, in fact, and an important distinction to make is when this plant was shut down in 1989, it wasn't, in an operational context, shut down, not properly. We stopped working. And so liquids and processes were just stopped, freeze frame. Wherever it is, that's where it is, and it was that way for quite some time. And as you would examine the buildings and the interior of the buildings and the difficulties with draining liquids, cleaning glove boxes, ripping out pipes, we had plenty of surprises. Sometimes a pipe would open and we would open the pipe and it was unexpectedly contaminated, and sometimes with dust, which of course you don't want this contamination to be airborne. It poses even a greater risk, particularly with plutonium. That would be an unpleasant surprise. In other cases, as we were going to clean out buildings, there were issues that, not the ones you hear about usually from Rocky Flats, but things like asbestos, leaded paint, PCB contaminated paint, certainly a serious human health risk, not unique to Rocky Flats. But the distinction is the insides of the buildings were very complicated, very complex, and contained the lion's share of the contamination. I'd give you a percentage, but I'd get it wrong, but greater than 99%. And so as you look at challenges with the cleanup, 99% of those as well were inside the buildings. The contamination outside the buildings was very well cataloged. We have over 6 million data points, 6 million data points measuring some analyte, some contaminant of concern at this site. It is the best characterized piece of land, certainly in Colorado, if not in the entire West. The records were very well kept in terms of burial trenches. And when you had a trench available for drum storage or disposal or whatever it might have been, there was nothing, no process that needed to be avoided, because it was right there. That was standard practice, was you take your drums and you put them in these
This was
these
before
trenches.
the environmental laws.
Exactly right. But additionally, it's not a matter of trusting the DOE on this. The state independently looked at areas throughout the buffer zone and the industrial area. They said, that topography is not quite right. This photograph reveals something I want to look at further. And it was over 100 spots that where they looked just to make sure there wasn't something buried there, it hadn't been disturbed previously for some unknown reason. And they went through a thorough investigation and to validate our characterization of the site. We have satellite imagery. We've had site-wide aerial-based radiological scans of the site. It is just extremely well characterized site, and the notion of a big problem existing somewhere that we're unaware of isn't credible. When you look at the independent review of the site, as well as what Kaiser-Hill, EG&G, and the Department of Energy have done over the past 15 years or so, characterizing this site.
Does it ever seem to you, I mean, this is just a matter of opinion, I guess, does it ever seem to you that you all have been blamed for things that were done before, not on your watch?
Well,
have to suffer the consequences of that?
I've never felt blamed for past practices. However, it is extraordinarily difficult to emotionally separate what's happened in the past from what's happening now. And so if there's a community member, an elected official, interested in Rocky Flats issues, they've been out there living in Colorado for a while, a lot of negative feelings about the production mission. Maybe they were here for the '69 fire, for the FBI raid. So a lot of angst, a lot of anger about this site, about the health risks it may pose. And that carries over. And how could it not? We're the same Department of Energy, even though we like to think that we've been innovative and open, and I believe we have. We're the same. And as far as the citizen is concerned, looking at us, it's still big government. It's a government agency. And so that's almost always a factor in your discussions, and that creeps back in terms of trust, in terms of thoroughness of the cleanup. And I have to keep that in mind, that many of these community members have, they've been in their position a lot longer than I've been in mine. And so they have the history of this place, and that colors everything as you move forward, and I have to remember that. But no, I don't feel I've ever been blamed for the production mission and for the poor environmental practices and the fires and so forth. But there's always going to be difficulty certainly separating the emotion of the past mission from the progress in the current mission.
Has it been difficult for you to sometimes, I know having been to one or two of the community meetings, sometimes they get a little hot. How do you handle that?
I suppose once or twice when I first got here, I took it personally, and had to have coaching from others to say, this isn't about you. This is about this process, or this is about this decision. And so I wasn't prepared for that, and it took me a while. I don't recall exactly how long, probably a good year actually, to be honest, to where I said, okay, I'm just a part of this process, and I'm representing the entire government here to these folks. And so I need to understand some of that comes with the territory. A lot of different relationships, and they're all individuals, even within the same organization, such as the Citizens Advisory Board, or the same government, be it Broomfield or Jefferson County, Arvada, Westminster, Boulder. There's still individuals in there, and I've always found that to be very good. Working one-on-one between the meetings, between the big meetings, understanding their interests and letting them understand where I'm coming from. And I found that has been very successful, not always in reaching agreement, but at least in reaching understanding on our perspectives, and that maybe we're not untrustworthy, but we just have very different opinions on how a situation should be handled, or what the correct decision should be. Occasionally, not anytime real recently, but we will still have the hot meeting. By and large, the discourse has been very civil over the past 5 to 8 years. But those happen. I believe, frankly, I believe that the Department of Energy has gotten better at not taking undeserved attacks. Now, I'm not saying that's the rule. But that can flare up every now and then. And I think that we're more confident in our cleanup mission, our current mission, that if the rhetoric gets just a little too loud and a little too insulting or personal, I think we've gotten better at correcting that and trying to redirect the discussion, saying, look, that's not what we're about here. You need to express it towards this issue, not towards me. And so I think we've learned a lot as well. I believe early on we were much more acquiescent and ready to take blame, and probably much of it deserved, considering on the heels of the production mission and the FBI raid and the grand jury. But as we got our sea legs, as we started to have a track record of accomplishment, shipping wastes, tearing down buildings, meeting our commitments in general, then I think that first we had more trust from the community that we actually were achieving things, but also on our side, we were starting to get our own identity and perspective that yes, we are the environmentalists, we are cleaning up this site, and while we respect and acknowledge the legacy and how it can color our discourse with the community, we're also going to start to develop our own identity and to challenge the community as we become successful to have them acknowledge that and let that be a part of their new history that's affecting the dialogue is our successes as well.
Something that it seems to me, at least in the press coverage of Rocky Flats over the years, that during the years of production, one heard the name of the contractor, whoever it was, and very seldom did the Department of Energy, was that a lead, you know, the person from the DOE, was that a lead person, at least in the, from an outsider's perspective. And that seemed to have shifted. Do you think that that reflects a real shift, or is it just the way things are being reported, or do you have any thoughts about that?
I'm not very familiar with that, other than for quite some time there was a very small DOE contingent out here, up through the 80s. And then as we were an area office reporting to Albuquerque. And then as we became an operations office, which has connotations of budget authority and reporting to headquarters, we staffed up. And in fact, when I arrived in 1996, the federal staff was about 320. That was around its peak. We're now down to about 35 to 40, I believe, and we'll be down to 5 to 10 here in the next 6 months. And so it's partly a function, I think, of taking over as an operations office versus an area office reporting to Albuquerque.
And I suppose the fact of the liability issue made it much more imperative that the Department of Energy have more representation and more oversight?
I can only speculate on that, but it seems like that was probably a sign of the times with the FBI coming out to the site, with the changing mission from production to somewhat static and then moving on to the environmental remediation, that there was a greater mission for the federal staff now that we were not in a fairly predictable production mode.
We're just about to run out of tape. I wonder if I could change it and we could continue a little while
Absolutely.
longer?
Let's see.
Okay.
I can.
Continuation of the oral history with Joe Legare. I think we'll just kind of pick up where we were. There's something I wanted to ask you. You mentioned before about the giving the incentive to Kaiser-Hill, the closing up, and that would be an incentive. And as I understand it, there's some kind of an award that they get.
Yes.
For maybe you could talk more about that, and maybe talk about, is this a good thing or a bad thing or mixed or whatever?
It is the contract structure with Kaiser-Hill at the time in February of 2000 when this contract was signed was very unique in the Department of Energy. What the department negotiated with Kaiser-Hill was a target number. How much is it going to cost to clean up this site? And rounded, it's $4 billion from February of 2000 until completion. And it was based on the best information we had and Kaiser-Hill had. That was a negotiation. How much we knew about the site, how much waste we were going to need to move, how many workers over how many years. Kaiser-Hill was then incentivized to do better than that. And one of the, I think, commonly held misconceptions of this cleanup is that Kaiser-Hill is incentivized to do it faster. In fact, they're not. To a very limited extent they are, but it's almost rounding error, if you will, compared to the incentive for doing it more efficiently. So there is a schedule incentive, but the cost incentive is much, much larger. And the cost incentive is such that with the $4 billion target cost, actually just under $4 billion, for every dollar that is saved by doing things more efficiently, Kaiser-Hill gets 30 cents. And we now have, excuse me, we now have an itchy nose. We now have a fee structure that's slightly more complicated, but in general, that's accurate. That's close enough, if you will, for the purpose of this discussion. So 30 cents on the dollar, which means the government gets 70 cents, which is good as well. On the flip side, if it costs an extra dollar, Kaiser-Hill pays that 30 cents as well, which is very unique, a contractor taking on liability of paying for scope. And so it was a double-edged sword, if you will. Kaiser-Hill, and their chief negotiator was Bob Card at the time, said, you know, we can do better than $4 billion. I believe we thought they could as well. How much better remained to be seen. And that was an appropriate incentive. Now, what the contractor needed from us was flexibility to schedule the work they thought it would be most efficient in terms of which buildings they tackled first. Did they do buildings or did they do the soil remediation, where they shipped the waste? And so the DOE also had to trust but verify, if you will, the work sequencing and the completion of work. Kaiser-Hill was using their judgment on how most efficiently to achieve that work. And we would provide oversight for safety purposes and to ensure that all expenses were appropriate. So it looks now like Kaiser-Hill is going to save money, and they're going to come in somewhere in the mid 3.5, 3.6 billion dollar range, thereabouts. We'll see. We have a few months to go yet. And so when you look at the difference between the $4 billion and where they actually come in, they get 30% of that. Now, when you go back only to, so the question is, well, is this a good deal for the government? It's a great deal for the government. And we should be doing this everywhere we can, not only at Department of Energy sites, but base realignment and closure sites for Department of Defenses. And we may very well be. I haven't worked in that area. It allows Kaiser-Hill to follow a business model for doing this work, not a government model. I don't believe that we have a reputation within the government for developing, implementing, and then retiring programs. In fact, we have a reputation, speaking out of school a little bit, for developing, implementing, and perpetuating programs. It's very hard to kill a government program. Congress can do that rather precipitously, but
usually doesn't.
But if you leave it in the hands of the implementers, it doesn't always work that way. And so applying a business model in Kaiser-Hill, the cleanup contractor, developed their baseline, sequenced the work. They would ask us for help, government-furnished equipment, information when they needed it, be it security clearances or a waste receiver site or opening up Savannah River to receive the special nuclear material, those types of things. But otherwise, they would decide where to deploy the workforce every day or every week or every month. And we would observe that and provide feedback and provide safety oversight. And it turned out, looking back now, to be very efficient. And when you look at the cost of completing the project and then add on the fee that they will receive, it is still billions less than our detractors had forecast it would take to complete this project decades from now. And so it's turned out to be a tremendous deal. Cleanup of these sites, DOD and DOE, is one of the biggest liabilities of our government. And it is in all of our interests to find the ways to do it most expeditiously, effectively, compliantly. Another question you might ask, well, did you cut corners to finish so quickly and to be in around 3.5 billion versus 4 billion? And the answer is we actually are more conservative in this cleanup than the law would allow us to be. They'd allow us to have done The law would have allowed us to have done less of a cleanup. And in part, it was just good business. We don't want to have to go back and do this again. And so, whether it was establishing the cleanup levels and working with the community to do that, or how it was actually implemented in the field, take an extra scoop. Don't dither too long with where that line is for how much you have to dig. Just go do it. When you look at the total cost of mobilizing this workforce, of planning this project, that was the smart way to go. And so at the end of the day, not only did we do it more efficiently through innovation and through using a business model versus a government model, they actually got a better cleanup. The department did, Kaiser-Hill performed a better cleanup, and the regulators in the community got a better, safer cleanup than if we'd been splitting hairs at each juncture on how much we should clean up. Should we take the extra scoop?
Can you talk a little bit about the Department of Energy's role in the long-term monitoring? I don't think most people on the outside really understand. How are you going to watch it?
That's a good question. When the physical completion has been achieved, there is still an ongoing mission at this site, the monitoring, maintenance, surveillance. And the Department of Energy is responsible for that. Not unlike any other EPA Superfund site where you have a responsible party implementing a cleanup. We're a responsible party, the Department of Energy, and the EPA and the State Health Department will hold us accountable to continue to ensure the safety of the cleanup. What that means is monitoring groundwater and surface water, doing surveillances, walking around, for example, where there's a landfill with a cap on it. We have 3 ongoing groundwater treatment cells that are in the ground and mostly passive, where the water comes through, is filtered or treated, and then released back into the environment. We need to make sure those continue to function properly. So there'll be an ongoing mission at the site. It'll be the Department of Energy that still has the ownership of the site, and they will contract out for those services to have water engineers and technicians primarily performing those samples, sending them to labs for analyses, and reporting back to the regulators.
Will there be soil sampling too, or just water sampling?
Not typically routine soil sampling. It has been so extensively characterized and remediated that there's not a great deal of uncertainty about the conditions of the soil, nor the water for that matter. But one of the reasons that we have the ongoing water sampling program is that could be a transport mechanism should there be, for example, buried radioactive contamination or even solvents, the ones you've heard about, TCE, PCE, carbon tetrachloride. And so should there be a migration of some contaminant, we would determine that through groundwater and surface water sampling. Now, there could be a scenario where if a condition were to arise, an unexpected condition, and we needed to identify where the problem came from, that could involve soil sampling, but there won't be routine soil sampling as a matter of post-closure care and monitoring. Written into the Superfund law as well is a periodic review after closure of the site. And so it's not more than 5 years after signing the record of decision on the closure of the site, we will have a review, look at all the data, the monitoring data, how the remedy has performed, and a determination could be made to either step up or step down some of that monitoring to fix something that's not working, or to remove something that's served its purpose. And so it's a periodic checkup on the cleanup to make sure it remains protective of the community. And so we would see the first one of those probably by 2010, I would say.
Now, in terms of the wildlife refuge, as I'm sure you're aware, there's been a lot of dispute about that. Is it really safe to have people going out. What would you say to, if someone came to you and said, should I take my 5-year-old out there to ride horseback? What would you say? What answer would you give?
And in fact, there's been an extraordinary amount of discussion about future use of the site and its safety for being a wildlife refuge. As you may be aware, first, there will be a DOE retained area as well as the refuge areas.
And could you describe what that retainer would be?
Yes, and they are both being cleaned up to the same standard. The reason there is a DOE retained area is that is the area of an ongoing remedy. We have the landfills there, the groundwater treatment cells, and it is identified in the enabling legislation for the refuge that the DOE needs to have those ongoing ownership of those remedies, anything related to the cleanup mission of the site. In terms of the safety, the site, the cleanup is not yet complete. The site could be open today to be a refuge with no safety concerns related to contamination out there in the buffer zone. One of the challenges we have in overcoming, and we used to have these little yellow buttons that said, "It's the plutonium, stupid." Now, why are we unique? Why? My apologies. I thought I turned this off earlier. Let's start that over. So, is the refuge safe? It is absolutely safe. It's safe today, let alone in the next year or two when it opens to be a refuge. We used to have these buttons that said, "It's the plutonium, stupid," and that's what makes us unique. Now, plutonium is absolutely a hazard, and it's an inhalation hazard, and it's a dangerous compound. It's a dangerous element. However, when you look at residual contamination at this site, and you compare it to other risks in your everyday environment, it is comparable, if not less. And that this is not voodoo science. Your body does not distinguish the source of radiation. Plutonium is a source of radiation. Just as we have cosmic radiation, we have radiation from thorium, radon, uranium in the soils. The truth about the cleanup is you will receive less exposure from radiation hiking on this site as a refuge than you will taking a cross-country flight. Now, some people scoff, but in fact, that is good science, and that is the truth about the cleanup. We don't live in a risk-free society. There are risks all around us, and we make choices. But the truth is about the hiking trails and the buffer zone and being a refuge, that risk just is not there. It is a risk that you can model, but it is not a risk that you can measure. We assign it numbers because some of our regulations talk about risk in terms of scientific notation and 1 in a million or 1 in 100,000. So we can assign that risk numbers, but that's only because we can model it. We cannot measure the risk at Rocky Flats. It is so low.
And what kind of fence will be around the central area that will be? Will it be a fence, or is that decided?
There is discussion about that, and the purpose of a barrier would be for management purposes. And that's unfortunate that the notion of a fence has perpetuated this idea that it's unsafe to go into this DOE retained area. Again, it's cleaned up to the exact same standard as the refuge areas. And the greater concern would be having people interact with the remedies to disturb them. It is not to protect the people from the remedies, it is to protect the remedies from the people. And so if there is in fact a fence to demarc the management boundary, it would probably be something very similar to what's out there now at the outer perimeter, which is a prairie fence, 2, 3, or 4 strand barbed wire, something that you'd have to look hard to see if you were more than a couple hundred yards away, something that would allow wildlife to pass through, because it's our intention that The animals enjoy all the benefits of the DOE retained area just as they do in the refuge area, and there is no reason, no safety and health reason why they shouldn't. And the whole notion of the fence as a management boundary now, as I look back, it's somewhat regrettable that we talked about that. I would have preferred some other mechanism because, again, the fence, I think, has reinforced for some that this central area is unsafe. And in fact, it's because we're doing water monitoring, we have ongoing groundwater treatment, we have landfills with covers, and so they're not the ideal places for hiking trails because there's a potential that the remedy could be disrupted. Wouldn't likely have gross or grave environmental consequences, but it would be expensive. It would be something you need to repair. Your data would not be good for that week or month or quarter. And so as we look at some type of prairie fence to navigate and surround the DOE retained area, it is for that distinction.
As you look back at the years that you've spent here, what do you see as, maybe the hardest or the most frustrating thing or things that you've done?
The soil action level process, I think, was perhaps the greatest challenge, and there were a real diversity of interests. And in some cases, there were interests in having a very specific result, regardless of what the process and the science led us to. And so it was a challenge to continue with that process and to ensure that, try and keep everyone engaged in that, recognizing that for some, they just wanted to see the science. For others, they just wanted to see the independent peer reviewers that were hired by a third party to oversee everything that we were doing. And for others, they wanted a specific result. And so trying to have, the challenge was having an earnest, legitimate, above-board process where the players all had very different interests and trying to design a process that incorporated all those interests without corrupting the technical basis for where we ended up. At the end of the day, we had other stakeholders in that process, in addition to the folks from the 7 or 8 surrounding communities and the citizens groups. And they were Congress and the Department of Energy. And so while we could incorporate all of these interests, there were limits in terms of the law and in terms of legislative intent for the appropriations that we received. And so it could be frustrating. And a lot of constraints, a lot of good ideas. Ultimately, we prevailed. I think all perhaps a few pounds heavier and a few hairs lighter after the process, and a significant challenge, very frustrating at times, but we stuck with it. And to their credit, the contractor and the State Health Department and EPA were all very courageous as well as the stakeholder groups and individuals to stick it out. Because sometimes they were shouting matches, other times it was collaborative and congenial, and but regardless, we kept coming back to the table, as did they, the stakeholders, and we prevailed. So that was probably the biggest challenge and the biggest frustration, but ultimately it was also an enabler for being successful.
What were one or several of the most kind of satisfying and most enjoyable parts of this work for you?
It's interesting now as I'm leaving, and my last day is likely tomorrow, maybe Thursday morning. So I have just a couple of days left here, and public service means a lot to me. And my father, after leaving the Air Force, went to work for the government as well, and he retired at 55 after his time in the government. And so I really have tried to act with integrity and with making sure the government got their money's worth, both out of me and with the money that they're sending to Rocky Flats, to meet my commitments and to treat people with respect. We spend too much time at work, sometimes more than we spend with our families, to not have it be a place where at least we treat each other with respect. And as I now have a couple of days left, it's been actually very satisfying. I've had a lot of kind words from both from my peers in the DOE, as well as from members of local governments and the regulators that have said, thanks, I believe you did act with integrity and I appreciate all that you've done. And that's been more gratifying than anything. We really put our heads down and work hard to achieve what we've achieved here. And so we don't spend too much time patting each other on the back. And so it's kind of nice, as I have a couple of days to go, to hear these things, because we don't spend a lot of time either at these CAB and coalition meetings and other public meetings in group hugs and how do you feel today. It's, we're down to business, and we're discussing, arguing, negotiating, and we're in and we're out and we're planning for the next one. And so taking just a couple of days breather now, and I'm getting some emails and calls. It's nice to hear that, because and I believe that that would be said of a lot of other people as well that have been involved in the process. But that's been very satisfying, because you can never be sure when we have different interests and we argue where that stops. And it seems like a lot of it is stopped with the issue, which is nice to understand and have that acknowledgement. We just disagree on this here. We're over here and we're arguing about this, not about each other. And that's nice to be able to do that and to engage with gusto and on the other side as well. And but then to recognize that we all want the same thing, which is a good cleanup and assurances that it'll stay safe.
Maybe we should stop there.
Okay.
Well, let me ask you first, is there anything that we haven't covered that you think is, an important part of your work here or the Rocky Flats?
Yes.
Okay.
One thing that I don't think we've discussed that was, and it's sometimes ironic that I think it's overlooked, because this cleanup could not have happened without the workforce. And why do I think they're overlooked periodically? Well, they don't go to public meetings. They don't interact with headquarters of the regulators or Senator Allard or Congressman Udall or Beaupre. And so they don't get the face time, if you will. But in fact, these are the folks, many of them that worked here during production, that go in, put on respirators and a couple of sets of anti-seed clothing and cool suits when it's hot. And they're the ones that are going in and cutting the pipes and ripping out the glove boxes and packaging the waste. It goes without saying, but perhaps should say, that we could not have achieved it without their dedication. Now, early on, I think the contractor recognized this, and they worked with the union leadership of the various unions to first ensure that they understood the mission, and it's a new mission, but also to understand what they need. Say, we're asking you to work yourselves out of a job, and quickly. And for folks that have worked here, several generations in their family have worked at Rocky Flats, that's shocking. Well, I thought my kids were going to work here in some cases, or maybe my kids already have started working here. And so recognizing that the union and labor interest absolutely had to be understood and recognized and dealt with, I believe was vital to our success. And Kaiser-Hill negotiated incentives initially, and then separation benefits later in the process, so that these workers understood what it meant for them to work themselves out of a job early, and what it meant for them financially, in terms of their career, in terms of being able to move to another site, whatever their interest was, and what the limits and what the flexibilities were for the department and for Kaiser-Hill to help them. This would not have happened had we not taken that on back in the 90s with these unions, and the union representation and the workers have just been superb. Just couldn't have happened without them.
Now, it is true, is it not, that the corporation of Kaiser-Hill and the individuals at the top level are the ones that get the monetary incentive? It's not spread through the workforce, is it?
Well, I don't know the specifics of how the final fee for Kaiser-Hill will flow down through the ranks. On a broader basis, several years ago, we negotiated, the site, Kaiser-Hill negotiated with the unions benefits and separation that related to a formula of age and years of service, and tried to capture as many of the workers, as much of the workforce as they could, to make it in their interests to accelerate closure, to work efficiently. A separate piece is the fee that you mentioned, and the final fee to Kaiser-Hill. How they distribute that amongst their executives and next level and to the workforce, I'm not familiar with.
Now, as I understand it, just one more question. The long-term liability, to put it that way, rests with the Department of Energy and the federal government, right? Kaiser-Hill does not, once their contract is done.
For worker benefits? Yes. Both in terms of worker benefits and the environmental liabilities on the site, Department of Energy is responsible for those, and will continue to meet those commitments. The contractor, the administrator, those names can change, but the ultimate responsibility, accountability, and liability is with the Department of Energy.
Yeah. Anything else that we haven't discussed that?
No, I just wanted to make sure we'd spent a little time on the workers, and I should have started there. I have not been that involved directly with union issues. Those Kaiser-Hill handles those, but it was very apparent on our side that that was an essential piece. We had superb.
And you gave direction to Kaiser-Hill with respect to that?
In general terms, yes. But at the top level, aligning the workforce and the congressional delegation, the Colorado congressional delegation, and getting the regulators on board and incorporating their interests with our interests, and then also speaking with one voice to the maximum extent that we could here in the Denver area, in the Rocky Flats area, with the communities and the agencies. Those pieces were just essential to maintain the focus and confidence of headquarters and of Congress that we were all on the same page at the macro level and wanted the same thing that was so important to achieving our funding every year and then ultimately to closing the site this year.
Just one more question. Where are you going?
I'm leaving here next week and starting anew in Idaho at the Idaho Closure Project. Unique challenges, but they had a different piece of the defense nuclear weapons production mission, and so I'll be getting started there.
Well, we should stop here probably.
Okay.
Thank you very
You
much.
bet. It was bothering me.